Good evening, everybody. If I can have your attention just for a few minutes. First of all, it's a great pleasure to see all the participants, hopefully I say that, all the participants here for this gala dinner. And tomorrow we begin the real work from 9 o'clock in the morning. But this evening, we have a number of speakers that I'm privileged to introduce. I didn't anticipate that I would have to introduce them, but that's the way things have worked out. Many unexpected events have occurred as a result of the visit of His Holiness, Pope Franciscus. And I hope you'll forgive any inconveniences that happened along the way, which we can entirely blame upon the head of the Roman Catholic Church, which is a relief after so many centuries of having been scapegoated. But it's my pleasure, first of all, to introduce the president of the Hebrew University, Menachem ben Sasson, Professor Menachem ben Sasson, who is a remarkable person in his own right, somebody that I have known ever since I arrived at this university in 1981. And I have a little story, an anecdote, which no doubt Menachem will either add to or correct. From that early experience, I was a complete newcomer in the Department of Jewish History, Historia shel Am Yisrael. I had been brought here largely under the auspices of the late Professor Shmuel Ettinger, and I was just finding my way through the extraordinary complex labyrinth of the Israeli bureaucracy. And I discovered to my horror that many years earlier, when I had come for a student year to Israel, I had been actually registered by some well-meaning official of the World Union of Jewish Students as a new immigrant. That was back in 1970, without my knowledge. And therefore, as far as the system was concerned, I had used up all my rights, which was a very important subject in those days. Things have changed since then. And so I discovered I had no rights as a new immigrant. And that had quite some serious implications. So I went to Professor Ettinger and explained my dilemma, because it was a crucial moment when they were about to decide to give me tenure, and I was supposed, in return, which I did, to take Israeli citizenship. And he said to me two words I've never forgotten. He said, "Tidaber im Menachem." Speak with Menachem. Menachem was a youngster, a real youngster. I guess you're probably about 31 at that time. I thought I was the youngest member of this department until I met Menachem. And he was a lecturer and very personable, very polite, which was unusual. That was a new experience. And I understood that I simply had to present him with a problem and he would fix it. And it turned out, which I didn't know at the time, that he was related, fortunately, to the Minister of the Interior, the famous Dr. Joseph Burg. And in an incredibly short time, my problem was satisfactorily resolved. So I learned two things. I learned that Menachem ben Sasson was undoubtedly going to one day become president of the Hebrew University, because anybody who could fix a problem like that obviously had a special talent. And secondly, I learned the importance of what in those days was called vitamin P. P standing for protectia, which again is less important than it was, but has not disappeared yet from these shores. Menachem Ben Sasson has not only been president of this university for many years, before that he was rector, and before that he was a member of the same department as myself, and a specialist. Indeed, he got his PhD in the field of Islamic studies. And among the languages that he speaks, in addition to Hebrew, English, French, and German, is Arabic, which I think is also worth noting. And in addition, he has been a prominent figure in Israeli public life. He even spent a number of years in the Knesset as a member of Kadima. Sometimes I think, Menachem, if I dare to say this, that the way they treated you there, in a way, means that the subsequent demise of Kadima in various ways that I would rather not go into was not wholly undeserved. Without further ado, I hand over to the president of the Hebrew University.
Thank you, Professor Wittrich. Yes, I will fix what you've just heard, because there was no problem actually, nothing to solve. Therefore, we didn't have to use any connections, any special attitude from whoever is or was. You just went through the highways of excellence of higher education, and the role models that you gave, I think, convinced everybody around that not having you in Israel and started calculating years and statuses will be a big mistake. So it was so easy to explain after having your CV with me that I didn't have to have in my hands any connections. The topic that you chose to this conference is of urgent to us, of importance to many abroad, and actually it is needed to the fixing of our nowadays world. Students are thirsty to find answers in campuses all over the world, not necessarily in Egypt or maybe in Syria, but when you go to the campuses in what we call the free world, we wait, or they wait, to answers. They want to decipher what they see in demonstrations. They need some support and understanding what's behind, and they need tools, if I may say, in order to meet with the challenges that they have daily in the campuses. Secondly, not many are aware of the resurfacing, again and again, motives that go back to the 5th century, going ahead to the 10th and 11th century, and to the Stimme and on. It's now translated to Arabic, Persian, and many other languages, and it surfaces just naturally. It's become natural truth to many. So without going to the hard data, to the hard facts that you are working on, and I'm looking forward to have, I said it to Robert beforehand, to have at least the summaries of some of the presentations, because we need them in less than 3 weeks to public gathering of the Board of Governors of the Hebrew University, because we're dedicated already one session to this topic. I believe that the materials that this center creates, the bibliography, the working papers, the conferences, will be and are of a need, because you have to know what are the horizons, if one can speak about. What is the depth of this phenomena of hatred that you seem to analyze as symmetrical? Israel, Judaism, and if you heard the Prime Minister of Canada who visited with us, and he said it already 2 years ago in a very blunt, clear way, So we need the works that you are doing, and we will use it. As I said, we need it for our work, educational work. We need it for the research. We need with you to analyze the backs and then the fronts of it. And you are capable of peeling and enabling to decipher. But it is needed, as I said, nowadays almost urgently in order to do educational work worldwide. You see the view outside, it speaks for itself. One can hate many things. I'll finish just with a beginning of a thought that I gave to myself. One of the problems that we face here in Jerusalem, that everybody comes with ultimate truth, divine truth that this piece of land or this piece of world or this text or this language is the holiest and there is no space for the others. Is it a case? Do we have some space to the others? And as some of you who are committed to 3 times of prayers every day know that when we finish our prayer of 18, actually 19 different units in it, what we call Shmoneh Esrei, we take 3 steps back, and we say, Oseh Shalom b'imromav, who makes peace up in heaven, Hu yaseh shalom aleinu, will make peace among us, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Why do we need this language of the body language of going backwards 3 steps? Because whenever you want to create a process of understanding, if you give a space to the other, even if it is symbolic, only 3 steps, and he has these 3 steps back, and she has 3 steps back, then it's enough of creating some space in order to understand. And that's the goal, or that's the gist of this conference. So I look forward to understand the space, and at the same time I look forward to understand the analysis that goes to nowadays problems that we all face. And I thank you for coming to Jerusalem. It's time to thank Robert for many years that he has been running this center in skillful, sophisticated, very diligent way, and you are part of this diligent work. He is the one who took this center ahead, and I hope that in the years to come, we find the resources that he was capable talently to bring, and more in order to dedicate ourselves to the deciphering, understanding, and to the hardcore of data that we want to share with everybody who's interested and maybe who's even not interested to hear. And that's the way that we share from time to time facts, analytical work, and conclusions of research. Thank you again. I have to apologize. It's in between sessions. I was also late because of the Pope. I had to welcome him. He landed in our premises. And now it's yourselves who are going to continue with this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Menachem, for those words. I now have the pleasure to introduce a man without whose contribution we literally would not be gathered here this evening. There are people who believe that everything in this universe is random, chance happening. There are those who believe in providence, and there are those, perhaps, who believe in something in between, even if we can't quite define it. I would define my apparently chance encounter with Charlie Knapp as providential, and the proof of that is that we're gathered here tonight. Because a year ago, or thereabouts, when we met on the campus of Mount Scopus, I had never met him before. He had never met me. There was an intermediary from the campus of Givat Ram, a professor who called me and warned me that Mr. Knapp of the Charles Knapp Family Foundation would be coming to see me, and that he was interested in the subject of anti-Semitism. And would I agree to see him at short notice? And there was no problem about that. We met, we spoke. I already had in my mind the concept of this conference, but not the details, and I didn't see any way in which our center, given the financial constraints and difficulties which it was facing, could undertake something of this scale. But I expounded my idea, and sometimes in life, it's rare, I have to say it's rare, you meet someone who not only understands immediately what you're saying, but is ready and willing to implement it right there and then, which is what happened, and that is most unusual. Charles is a very modest man. On the phone, he said, if you'll permit me to repeat this, he quoted from Winston Churchill when I said, how would you like me to introduce you? And he said, well, as briefly as possible. And I said, well, why should I be that brief? And he said, well, you know what Churchill is reputed to have said, the man is very modest and he has a lot to be modest about. If that's not modesty, I don't know what modesty is. And I'm sure that the reality and the facts belie all of that, because Charles is, as we say in England, a barrister. And in American parlance, it's a little different. But he was, among other things, Assistant U.S. Attorney in New York. He worked with and for Robert Morgenthau. I understand for some of you, that name will be very familiar. And he has been very involved with the Hebrew University in a completely different area, which involves the natural sciences, biology, and other related things, which I'm sure he's much better qualified to talk about, and indeed to say a few words about the work of his foundation. So I'm delighted to be able to introduce him to you tonight.
I'm not quite the eminence of Professor Wistrich, so I have to lower the microphone a little bit. I will make one correction, and this has nothing to do with modesty, false or otherwise, but the family foundation is the Knapp Family Foundation, and the Knapp who is most important to it was my late father, from whom I learned so much. If Professor Wistrich had had the pleasure of meeting him, the list of his accomplishments would have gone on and on, which just goes to show that although the acorn does not necessarily fall too far from the tree, it doesn't necessarily grow quite the same way. The foundation, just a few words, it has a dual objective, but for our purposes, the main objective is to stimulate discussion, research, scholarly investigations of matters pertaining to Jewish culture, history, society. And that is part of our remit. I grew up in, I guess, the golden age of Upper West Side New York Jewry. By which I mean either through my ability to be oblivious to the obvious or living in something of a bubble, I really don't recall encountering much anti-Semitism growing up in the 60s and 70s in the city. What I do remember is family history. We, as I'm sure almost everyone in this room, lost family members in the Shoah. I, of course, knew survivors growing up. And my father, when he spoke about World War II, where he served in the Army Air Force as the lead navigator in his squadron, he would occasionally tell stories, one of which was, as the lead navigator, he was in charge once the bombing run started, and they bombed, in D-Day, they bombed, obviously, France, Germany, Romania. They were stationed in England. However, anti-Semitism was something that my father encountered almost daily from growing up farther north in Manhattan. To get to DeWitt Clinton High School, he and his friends had to run the gauntlet of the Irish and Italian gangs that would wait for the Jewish kids to wander by. My father became a pretty good boxer in college as a result. But in World War II, the navigators who worked under him did not like the idea that a Jew was the lead navigator. And they got together and they went to the wing commander to complain and have my father replaced by a Gentile. What the navigators didn't know was the wing commander was himself Jewish, so the protest did not go very far. But as I grew older and became more aware, anti-Semitism became something that preyed upon me as I saw it rear its ugly head in country after country. And in the United States, it's no different. And even in New York, there were many instances that came to my attention. You don't have to read too widely in world events. You don't have to remember what happened in Brussels a day or so ago, what happened in the United States last month in Kansas City, where Jews were targeted, but no Jews were killed. Unfortunately, 3 people who were not Jewish were killed because they were at a Jewish community center. These are the things that you see. If you don't want to read too widely, you can just look at the comments section in the New York Times, and you would be saddened by the types of commentary that arise. This conference is very important. You are all very important to, if not combating successfully, but at least stemming the tide of anti-Semitism as it becomes resurgent under the guise of anti-Zionism, under the guise of being against certain Israeli policies, which always seem to morph into being against the concept of the State of Israel, which means to be against the concept of the nationhood or the peoplehood of the Jews. All of the history is in this room. For this conference to be a success, not only does the scholarship have to be rigorous, but the publicity has to be there, because I think there are 2 audiences that you will be addressing primarily. One is the policymakers, the experts, and on that note, all I will say is that the comments that were attributed to Martin Indyk with respect to the most recent round of the peace process displayed such a level, in my view, such a level of ignorance, historical ignorance, for a man who is supposed to be so knowledgeable about the Middle East. It was shocking to me. Something is wrong. If I lived in a little bubble in the Upper West Side growing up, surely he and Secretary of State Kerry and President Obama are all living in some sort of bubble that needs to be burst. You are the people we look to lead the way in that. The second group that I think you need to address are the mass of people who, to borrow a phrase, don't know how to ask the question. They don't understand. They hear little bits and pieces. Perhaps their attention span isn't so great. But they don't know, so they just go with what people tell them, what their friends tell them, or if they want to ingratiate themselves in a popular cause. And I look at the BDS campaign in the United States, which I'm happy to say has, by and large, faced failure upon failure, both in the United States and to some extent in Canada as well, and in Australia. But BDS, anti-apartheid, anti-colonialism, all these concepts of the university always made me wonder, where does it come from if you spend 10 minutes to understand the history? And where it comes from, I found out, was it's the last gasp of Soviet propaganda going back to the early 60s. That's where it began. So it made sense to me that it's mostly what we in the United States, I understand in Europe there are different meanings, but in the United States, what we would call the left-leaning groups, that is why they talk about anti-imperialism, they point to Israel, they talk about apartheid, they point to Israel. It has absolutely no bearing on anything, in my view. So you have to take on the mantle of the truth tellers. Our foundation is deeply honored to be able to assist in what is a very noble venture. It is unfortunately a necessary venture. And I will make one final point, and it is this. The conference starts tomorrow. In my family, that's an auspicious day. May 26th would have been the 119th birthday of my cousin Salo Baron, from whom I had learned much of the history, and from whom I have an understanding of what true scholarship is all about. So please, I know you'll do the best you can. It is very important, and as I said, it is my family's honor to be here in your presence. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles, for those remarks, and indeed it's an auspicious day tomorrow, and Salo Baron was one of the historians who most inspired me when I first became interested in Jewish history, and I didn't know we also share, in a more distant level, common roots from that part of the world where he was born in Polish Galicia, which is where my family originated from. It's an honor now to introduce an old friend and a very distinguished political and scholarly and judicial personality, Professor Irving Kotler, who, as most of you know, was only a few years ago the Minister of Justice in Canada, is a member of Parliament still in Ottawa, as well as being an emeritus professor of law at McGill University. I think pretty much everybody in this room would be aware of the fact that over many years, at least 40 years, if not more, Irving Kotler has carried a banner of human rights, the search for justice, and linked those things, which is not so frequently done these days, with the fight against anti-Semitism. That in itself is worth recalling and reflecting upon at a time when those who speak in the name of human rights so frequently, in fact, indulge in a kind of discourse that, whether deliberately or unintentionally, if we want to be charitable, in fact feeds many of the worst stereotypes that exist with regard to Jews and with regard to the Jewish state. I think that Irving has done as much as any single individual that I can think of to point out and to hammer home the nexus, the connection between the fight for human rights, understood, I think, in the way that it should be, and the issue of anti-Semitism. And in that capacity, he has been the co-founder and served as the international chair of the Interparliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism. So it's a great pleasure to ask him to say a few words on this occasion. He'll also be speaking later at this conference. Irving.
And thank you, Robert. I'm delighted to be part of this international gathering of scholars and experts, which has been organized and inspired by you, who have brought us all together. And I want to say, before I begin my remarks, that I regard Robert Wistrich as the preeminent scholar of anti-Semitism in the world today. Apart from being a distinguished professor of history here at the Hebrew University, but his work, among others, on anti-Semitic lethal obsession is really those of us who've been able to appreciate it in its comprehensiveness and fulsome breadth and depth is a monumental work, and one which will serve as an encyclopedic reference guide for all those involved in the study of anti-Semitism. And while he has had to succumb to the mandatory requirements of the Hebrew University in terms of teaching, I'm delighted that he will continue to be the director of the Vidal Sassoon Center, that he will continue to inspire us with his scholarship, and we, Robert, will all continue to be your beneficiaries. So thank you. The underlying thesis of my remarks, and it was rather dangerous of Robert to invite me to expand a little bit on some of these remarks, but I'll try. I don't want to, I know that with Jews, I never want to compete with Jewish metabolism and stand between you and the middle. So I will try to be brief, but underlying thesis of my remarks is that the phenomenon of anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that we have been witnessing now, developing incrementally, sometimes imperceptibly, very often indulgently, for some 40 years now. And what has been transpiring has been the emergence of an old, new, sophisticated, global, virulent, and even lethal anti-Semitism, reminiscent of the atmospherics of the 30s, and I would say without parallel or precedent since the end of the Second World War. This new anti-Jewishness overlaps with classical anti-Semitism, but is distinguishable from it. It found early juridical and institutional expression in the United Nations Zionism is Racism resolution, which the late Senator Daniel Moynihan, in a very pithy but compelling statement, referred to it as giving the abomination of anti-Semitism the appearance of international legal sanction. But it has gone dramatically beyond that. The new anti-Semitism almost needs a new vocabulary to define it, a new set of indicators. If you look at the Anti-Semitism Global Survey just released by the ADL, an important survey in terms of the empirical responses to 11 questions, but that entire study was anchored in what I would call the conventional anti-Semitism matrix or index. It did not deal at all with the new anti-Semitism. And we need really a set of indicators, a matrix, to define the new anti-Semitism and put questions related to that. Because if we don't, then people will just feel that they only have to address the framework with regard to the old anti-Semitism. I found it intriguing that the question that had the highest response in terms of negative stereotypical responses was the one that had an Israeli dimension to it. Whether people believe that citizens of a country are more loyal to Israel than to the country in which they live. That had the highest level of negative stereotypical responses in that regard. So I think what we need is really a new matrix, and one perhaps anchored in what I would call an approach that is itself anchored in discrimination, in equality rights, in international law, so one can have a kind of comparative matrix or index in that regard. In a word, classical or traditional anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the rights of Jews as individuals or as a group to live as an equal member of whatever society they inhabit. The new anti-Semitism is a discrimination against, denial of, assault upon the right of the Jewish people to live as an equal member of the family of nations, or in its most disturbing manifestation, the right even to live. As it happens, Per Ahlmark, at the beginning of this century, observing the complex interaction between the old and the new anti-Semitism and the impact of the new and the old, summed it up, and I thought in a rather pithy observation as follows, and I'm quoting him here. Compared to most previous anti-Jewish outbreaks, this new anti-Semitism is often less directed against individual Jews. It is primarily directed against the collective Jew, the state of Israel. And then such attacks start a chain reaction of assaults on the individual Jews and Jewish institutions. In the past, the most dangerous anti-Semites were those who wanted to make the world Judenrein, free of Jews. Today, the most dangerous anti-Semites might be those who want to make the world Judenstaatrein, free of a Jewish state. Now, it's interesting that at around the same time, in a statement not noticed then, but repeated by Professor Elie Wiesel at the International Parliamentary Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism in Ottawa in November 2010, but Wiesel actually said this in 2001, and his remarks were as follows, and given the fact that Professor Wiesel is normally given to understatement in these regards, the remarks bear mention in that regard, and I'm quoting him. May I share with you the feeling of urgency, if not emergency, that we believe anti-Semitism represents and calls for. I have not felt the way I feel now since 1945. I feel there are reasons for us to be concerned, even afraid. Now is the time to mobilize the efforts of all of humanity. Now, it's these two statements from which I've abstracted from Per Ahlmark and Elie Wiesel, and the fact that moving into 2008 and 2009, we had the highest incidence of attacks on Jewish institutions, educational, religious institutions, persons and property, that invited and, in fact, called upon parliamentarians to come together to form the International Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism and to have an international conference in London in 2009 and then in Ottawa in 2010. And I'd like to commend to all of us here the reading and the appreciation of the London Declaration on the Combating of Anti-Semitism and the Ottawa Protocol for the Combating of Anti-Semitism. They are both read together really a roadmap, not only in terms of appreciating and analyzing anti-Semitism, old and new, but also set forth the ways and means that governments and parliamentarians and academics and scholars and NGOs and the like can work together to combat anti-Semitism. As the London Declaration itself affirmed, and I quote, "We are alarmed at the resurrection of the old language of prejudice and its modern manifestations in rhetoric and political actions against Jews, Jewish belief and practice, and against the State of Israel." So what I would like to do at this point is to briefly summarize some of the manifestations of this old new anti-Semitism that may have accounted for the sense of urgency, if not emergency, about anti-Semitism referenced in both the statements of Elie Wiesel and Per Allmark. The first indicator of this new anti-Semitism, and the most lethal manifestation of it, is what might be called genocidal anti-Semitism. I suspect that it's not fortuitous that the 21st century began on January 4th with a statement not by Ahmadinejad, but by the supreme leader Khamenei, who said that what we need to do at this point in terms of resolving the Israeli-Arab conflict is to bring about the annihilation of the Jewish state. That was said 4 days into the 21st century. And that, of course, presaged a whole series of similar statements. And while it may be thought that all this went away with Ahmadinejad, one should note that whatever Ahmadinejad said was sanctioned, and indeed with the authority, if not encouragement, of the supreme leader in that regard. So when I speak of a genocidal anti-Semitism, this is not a term that I would use lightly or easily. I'm referring here really to the Genocide Convention's prohibition against the direct and public incitement to genocide. And in fact, since we are meeting as well on the 20th anniversary of the Rwandan genocide, when 1 million Rwandans were killed in 3 months at a rate of 10,000 a day from April to June 1994, it's worth noting that the Supreme Court of Canada, in a case which dealt with the incitement of a Leon Mugesera, who interestingly enough came to Canada in 1992, 2 years before the genocide began, but which the court in its deliberations concluded that he was guilty of a crime against humanity, in the sense that the court concluded that the very incitement to hate and genocide constitutes the crime, whether or not acts of genocide thereafter follow. And as we know, the enduring lesson of the Holocaust, as well as the Rwandan genocide of that and former Yugoslavia and the like, is the danger of state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide. The Supreme Court of Canada itself put it again that the Holocaust did not begin in gas chambers, it began with words. And so if anti-Semitism is the most enduring of hatreds and genocide the most horrific of crimes, then the convergence of the genocidal intent embodied in anti-Semitic ideology, together with the convergence, the genocidal intent embodied in anti-Semitic ideology, is the most toxic of combinations. And there are at least 3 manifestations of this genocidal anti-Semitism. This group here knows it all only too well, but just to mention, the first is the state-sanctioned incitement to hate and genocide, in Khamenei's Iran. The second is the genocidal anti-Semitism in the covenants, charters, platforms, and policies of such terrorist movements as Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, and the like. I have to tell you that at one point in the Canadian Parliament, I got up and I read the Hamas charter into the record, and people were astonished because, one thing about the Hamas charter, it openly calls for the destruction of Israel and the killing of Jews wherever they may be. It does not seek to mask this genocidal intent. It speaks openly about the protocols of the elders of Zion. But what I found was the actual shock that the members in the parliament knew nothing, really, of what the Hamas charter was proclaiming as an obligatory call on its own people in that regard. And then the third manifestation of this genocidal anti-Semitism is the religious fatwas, or execution writs, where these genocidal calls in mosques and the media are held out as religious obligations, where Jews and Judaism are characterized as perfidious enemies of Islam, and where Israel becomes, as it were, the Salman Rushdie of the nations. In a word, Israel is the only state in the world today, and the Jewish people the only people in the world today that are the standing targets of state-sanctioned genocidal incitement to hate and, as I say, to genocide itself. This brings me to the second indicator, political anti-Semitism, which one could give a seminar in and of itself. But I'm just going to take very briefly two manifestations of political anti-Semitism, or the denial of fundamental rights to the Jewish people and only to the Jewish people. In other words, if genocidal anti-Semitism is a public call for an incitement to the destruction of Israel, political anti-Semitism is a denial of Israel's right to exist to begin with, or the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination, or the denial even of the Jewish people as being a people. And there are a number of manifestations of this, but just two in that regard. The first, as I mentioned, was the denial of the Jewish people's right to self-determination. And Martin Luther King put it in a succinct way and in a compelling way, and anchored it in a principle of equality when he said, it's the denial to the Jews of the same right, the right to self-determination that we accord to African nations and to all other peoples of the globe. In short, it is anti-Semitism. In other words, the denial to the Jewish people of equality before the law, of equal protection and equal treatment by the law, is in and of itself anti-Semitism. The other manifestation is denying the legitimacy, if not the existence, of the state of Israel. In other words, just as classical anti-Semitism is grounded in the denial of the very legitimacy of the Jewish religion, so is the new anti-Jewishness grounded in the denial of the very legitimacy of the Jews as a people, as embodied by the state of Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, or as I said, of the right even to be seen to be a people to begin with. In the words of the distinguished lawyer and scholar of anti-Semitism, Anthony Julius, himself also a person of understatement in his categorization and critique of anti-Semitism, summed up this second indicator of political anti-Semitism as follows, and I quote, "To maintain that the very existence of Israel is without legitimacy, and to contemplate with equanimity the certain catastrophe of its dismantling, is to embrace, however unintentionally, and notwithstanding all protestations to the contrary, a kind of anti-Semitism indistinguishable in its compass and consequences from practically any that has yet been inflicted on Jews." This brings me to a third manifestation of anti-Semitism, which I've also called ideological anti-Semitism or racialized anti-Semitism. And that is where anti-Semitism is laundered under the struggle against racism. Simply put, the first two indicators to which I referred are overt, they're public, they're clearly demonstrable. This one is much more sophisticated and arguably more pernicious. Indeed, it might even serve as an ideological support system for the first two. In a word, it finds expression in the laundering of anti-Semitism as part of the global responsibility and the global struggle against racism, of which the reference to Israel as an apartheid state is an expression which finds particular outlets in the campus culture. Now, it's not just calling Israel an apartheid state that's the problem. is that apartheid is defined in international law as a crime against humanity. So if you say that Israel is an apartheid state, what you are saying is that Israel is a crime against humanity. And so if it's a crime against humanity, then it has really no right to be. And I recall, and some of us who were talking about it at the reception just before, those of us who were there in Durban and recall that hate fest at Durban, may also recall the chanting that took place in the streets of Durban every day when people were marching, and in terms of this racialized anti-Semitism, said that the struggle against racism in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against racism in the 21st century now requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. And if there were not enough, then the reference was made to Israel not only as an apartheid state, but as a Nazi state. And if it's a Nazi state, therefore not only does it have no right to be, but there is an obligation to ensure that there's no right to be. Because how can we countenance the existence of an apartheid Nazi state in our midst, unless you think that this is just something that has not gotten any footage or currency? A study has shown, and Manfred Gerstenfeld has written about this, that some 40% of all Europeans believe that the Israeli treatment of the Palestinians is the same as the Nazi treatment of the Jews. In other words, Israel is the embodiment of a devil state. And if it's the embodiment of a devil state, again, not only no right to be, but the obligation to ensure that it has no right to be. So that dismantling Israel almost becomes a moral obligation, rather than being seen as a manifestation of what it is, the new anti-Semitism. That's why this is so sophisticated and yet so pernicious and prejudicial. And this brings me to a fourth indicator of the new anti-Semitism, and that is the laundering of that new anti-Semitism under the culture of human rights. I'll just do this in one line. In a world in which human rights has emerged as the new secular religion of our times, then to proclaim Israel as the meta-human rights violator of our time is to have Israel emerge as the new geopolitical antichrist of our time. And that has particular currency and fallout in the campus culture, where the Palestinian case and cause has become the poster child for human rights in a campus culture that is engaged, as it were, in its validation through the prism of human rights. And the last, there are other manifestations, but the last one that I want to mention at this point is the one that refers to the coming together, really, of what is the lie that will not die, and that is the protocols of the elders of Zion. But I'm not referring, the suffusion of contemporary discourse and analysis of the last, of the czarist forgery of the last 100 years. I'm not referring only to the protocol of the elders of Zion. I'm referring at this point to a whole sense of conspiratorial thinking and incitement that not only targets Jews, but ends up targeting Israel. Let me just give you two quick synopsises of these things to see it. And so Jews were accused of being, and I'm just taking you right to the beginning of this century, and so Jews were accused of being behind the 9/11 attacks, that they had in fact forewarning of these attacks, and therefore they left the building and were not themselves the object of attacks. That Jewish doctors are responsible for infecting Palestinians with the AIDS virus. This also mutates into different types of injections, but that's the type of thing which we are speaking about. That Jewish scientists were responsible for the propagation of the avian flu. that a Jewish astronaut was responsible for the explosion of the Columbia Space Shuttle, that Jews were behind the publication of the Danish cartoons, that Jews were responsible for the war in Iraq, that Jews were responsible for the genocide in Darfur, that Jews were recently responsible for the mining explosion in Turkey. I can go on. It never stops. Now, we say, okay, we know all this. You're not telling us anything we don't. But think of this repetition day in and day out. These lies that will not die on an unsuspecting, public, and how they internalize these lies that will not die and the impact that this has. Let me now just move to the same type of international conspiracy thinking as it applies now not to Jews, but to the international Zionist conspiracy that blames Israel and the Zionists for all the above and more. So here is how it works, and it's quite interesting. I just extracted, for the purposes of today, what happened just before our International Parliamentary Conference to Combat Anti-Semitism. I'm giving you now just a synopsis of what occurred in 2 months just before the conference. There was a slanderous article in Sweden's most popular newspaper, Aftonbladet, which held that Jews, in this case Israelis, abducted Palestinians in a conspiracy with American rabbis, killing them so as to steal their organs for transplant. In other words, the contemporary blood libel. And as lies have long legs, this libel made its way around the world and into Canada, and in fact was treated by the media on the occasion of our international conference as if this had some truth to it. And John Mann, who was interviewed on the Canadian TV, had to respond to a question put as if this in fact did occur. Then large circulation daily newspapers such as Al Watan in Qatar and Al Quds Al Arabi spoke of Israel as having crudely manipulated the swine flu epidemic, and did so in such a way so as to not only demonize Israel and its leaders, but to then end up blaming the Jews in Canada for being part of this entire conspiracy. Holland's daily, The Telegraph, held that the flu pandemics were an international Jewish conspiracy led by Israel to reduce the world's population. The whole reminiscent of another classic blood libel of the Jews as poisoners of the international wells. And then Palestinian and Mideast television all reported their own exclusion. This is all going on, you have to understand, in a period of several months before the conference, where they spoke of Israeli doctors now conducting Nazi-like experiments on Palestinian prisoners, referring again to the fact that Israel deliberately injected Palestinians with AIDS. One can go on and on, the lie will not die. So let me close with something that was said to me then by my fellow parliamentarians in good faith. I mean, these are not people who come necessarily with any kind of animus against Israel or Jews. It's just if you internalize a critical mass of this type of lies that will not die, then this leads to asking certain kinds of questions, which then become critiques, which then become indictments and the like. But here the question was, why are you having a conference on anti-Semitism? Are there not other racisms and other hatreds? Why are you singling out the discussion on anti-Semitism as if this itself became almost suspect? Repeated also, right now, when I was coming here, and my colleagues were asking me, where are you spending your break week? And I said, I'm going to Israel. They said, what for? I said, for an international conference on anti-Semitism. Again? And the question was as if, there are other things you should be dealing with. Forgotten was the fact that one of my first acts as Minister of Justice was to issue a national justice initiative to combat racism and hate. So let me close then to give some sense of what makes anti-Semitism distinguishable, why it is deserving of separate study. And one can say that in the same way that the Holocaust is a paradigm of radical evil, so anti-Semitism is a paradigm of radical hate. And in that regard, we need to appreciate, and I think it was put forth so compellingly in Robert Wish's book that the best thing I can do is refer us all to read it. That is, anti-Semitism is not only the oldest and most enduring of hatreds, but it is also one of the most lethal, that has caused catastrophic suffering to Jews, but not only to Jews who get caught up in this virus of anti-Semitism. Second, it's the only form of racism or hatred that has a global dimension. Simply put, there is no other vulnerable minority in the world today that is the target globally of this racist virus, and where that virus, by way of extension, as the London Declaration or Ottawa Protocol put it, not only propagates hatred against Jews, but propagates hatred against Israel as the targeted collective Jew among the nations. The third thing is the fact that anti-Semitism, in a global sense, is a manifestation of a state-orchestrated, state-sanctioned character of incitement and incitement to hate and genocide. The fourth thing is there's no other racism that is laundered, as I said, under the protective cover of the struggle against racism, the authority of international law, the culture of human rights, and one can go on. And that's what, as I said, gives it its sophistication, but also its danger. A fifth thing with regard to the distinguishable feature of anti-Semitism is the dramatic spike that we have been witnessing in attacks against Jews and Jewish institutions. You know all this, nothing more for me to add here. And the resurrection, finally, of all the classic libels. When I say classic libels, I mean the whole gamut of all the libels at the same time in a kind of critical mass of indictment, whether it be the blood libel in various manifestations, whether it be the notion of the Jew as the poisoner of the wells, and then you can also add Israel as the poisoner of the international wells, or whether it be the deicide libel, or whether it be the whole question of the protocols themselves, one libel after another, but now converging in a critical mass of indictment. And so my attempt this evening has been to try to summarize not only the indicators of the new anti-Semitism. As I said, I think we need to develop a matrix for this, and we can anchor it in a kind of an equality rights protection approach in that regard, but also the singularity of anti-Semitism, why it is a distinguishable hatred, why it partakes of characteristics that no other hatred does partake of. And so the time has come, I think it is past, not only for us to be sounding the alarm for some of the reasons that I've set forth, but really to act. Because as history has taught us only too well, that while it may begin with Jews, it doesn't end with Jews. And anti-Semitism is the canary in the contemporary mineshaft of evil. Thank you.
Well, after that tour de force, I feel the only thing I can say is amen. But we still have 3 days to go. And those 3 days, all of us in this room, I believe there are 39 different lectures that we will hear, are going to explore in depth, each one according to their own vision, the many complex aspects, some of which have been alluded to here tonight. And I certainly have no intention now of preempting any of those investigations. What I do want to say are a few practical points before we finally partake of the evening meal. One is that we certainly intend to bring together the results of our common endeavor here in Jerusalem. And as I think I wrote to you already, but I'd like to repeat it now, we have a publisher, the University of Nebraska Press. They are reliable. They produce good quality books. I think that the outcome of our deliberations and the written papers could result in a book that would appear in 2015, providing that we have from each of you a contribution not exceeding 5,000 words, somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000. That's carefully gauged, both in order to meet the requirements of a publisher these days reluctant to produce the kind of extremely lengthy books of which I myself, among others, have been guilty. So we have to take that requirement into consideration, which is why we're looking for articles which will be succinct, which will address in a concise manner the problem that you have chosen to deal with here. The more of such articles that we can produce, and the faster we can do that, the better, which is why I suggested that if we can receive your contributions at the very latest by the end of September, this will greatly facilitate the goal of having this book appear within a year from now, which I think is a realistic aim from my previous experience with this publisher. So that's one practical point. Second point, I'd just like to take the opportunity. Ruchama, wait. I was just about to say something very flattering. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the members of the Vidal Sassoon International Center I mentioned before. During the course of the previous year, our manpower was somewhat depleted. Only in the last month, thanks to an injection of new forces, young students from the Hebrew University who have joined us, thanks to the indefatigable labors of Ruchama Roth, who is not only in charge of administration, but has demonstrated on many occasions remarkable organizational talents, determination, and ability to hack through the labyrinth of, I can say this now the president's gone, of the Hebrew University internal bureaucracy. We are where we are, which is, believe me, an achievement. I know exactly what has been involved to get to this point, and it wasn't easy, despite all the help that we had and the wonderful cooperation of all the people who have come here and are going to make what I know to be an outstanding contribution. So I think our combined effort can make a significant addition. Let's not get carried away. There are many people in this field who are doing just that, and many of them are in this room. But I think that the mix that we have sought and hopefully will achieve in this conference of scholarly, rigorous analysis, of the practical experience and know-how of others who are not in the formal sense in academia, but who know this subject inside out, It's the combination and the synthesis of these things which could provide us with something that will be particularly valuable for exactly the kind of struggle that we're in and which Irving Kotler has outlined and which we are indeed all too familiar with. The challenges are huge, and as the Hebrew saying, the Pitgam says, you know, ha-melacha merubah, but the time is short. The task is great. The time is short, and it's our responsibility, all of us, to utilize that time to the fullest of our ability. So enjoy your meal and have a good night's sleep after it, and be ready in the morning to give of your collective wisdom. Thank you.